Welcome to the CFT's Online Course Design Institute, Module 3 on Assessing Student Learning. I'll be your guide, Joe Bandy. If I haven't already met you, nice to meet you, albeit virtually. At this point in the CDI's backwards design process, we hope you have greater clarity about your learning objectives and can focus on what is the next step, assessment. Here's an overview of the 5 parts of Module 3 that you've probably already seen in Brightspace. Part 1 on Introduction to Learning Assessment, the why, what, when, and at least some of the how of assessment. Let's start with the why, but we might want to start with why not. It's worth noting that it's possible at this point you may be having some apprehensions about the word assessment. That's because assessment can be a 10-letter word if we've experienced it in the ways captured by these adjectives, and often counter to the purposes of improving our practice. However, what if we were to imagine assessment differently, in a way that is captured by these adjectives instead? This is why we want to focus on assessment in this institute, and we hope you can keep these kinds of values in mind as we consider assessment in your course. Now to the what. Barbara Walvard defines assessment as the systematic collection of information about student learning, using the time, knowledge, expertise, and resources available. What is it that we assess? Well, it really depends, but we ask you to be intentional. What are your learning goals for your students? What is your teaching philosophy? What does this mean for your assessment? For example, if I have a philosophy of experiential and civic education, as many of you know I do, and I want students to become informed citizens who help solve social problems, I may wish to assess how my students understand those problems and policy debates about the various solutions, as well as how they apply their knowledge to real-world issues in community settings through, say, service learning projects. So how do I begin to do that? Well, I need a plan. You can't really begin without a plan, and like all good design processes, a good assessment plan is cyclical and iterative, beginning with clarifying goals and auditing current practice, deciding on what evidence you need to see from students to assess their learning, developing assessments that deliver that evidence, metrics and criteria by which you will judge it, then you judge it through evaluation and communicate the results, and ultimately assess your own course and how students learned to start the process again. As we think about this, it's important to know what Wiggins and McTighe call the assessment continuum. The truth is that throughout your course you can and probably do assess many things about your students' cognitive or personal development. These may range from informal checks on understanding during conversations, to observations and dialogues that you have with them that are more formal, to tests and quizzes, to longer prompts that ask them to take on larger tasks such as writing a paper, to big performance tasks, completing entire multi-course projects, for instance. This is all fine, but how do we match our assessment to our goals? And that'll vary across pedagogies, disciplines, and contexts, but generally we often see what is depicted here by Wiggins and McTighe. The core learning objectives, enduring understandings, require us to understand a great deal about how students come to apply, analyze, synthesize, and evaluate multiple elements from our courses, and thus demand multiple and complex forms of assessment over a course. More basic, discrete knowledge, that worth being familiar with, may be assessed using assignments designed to provide evidence of more basic learning, such as memory and comprehension, or possibly some application. The important to know and do objectives in the middle can be assessed using a wide range of assessments, from basic to highly complex, depending on the content. One important distinction to keep in mind here is that between formative and summative. Formative assessment is that which informs and can improve both the teaching and learning through all kinds of feedback. It's typically low stakes, ungraded, or minor grades, and it's administered in the middle of units, like discussion questions or ungraded quizzes. Summative assessment are those that we use to make judgments about achievement via grades. Therefore, they're typically more high stakes and the subject of a lot of attention by both us and our students. They're typically administered at the end of a unit or course, and the usual suspects of assessment forms are present here. However, you may have a lot of ideas about summative assessment, but not so many about formative assessments, despite the fact that you may do it regularly. This list of classroom assessment techniques may be helpful, if not exhaustive. Please feel free to linger here if you have ideas that you'd like to pursue, but an important note is that all of these can be used in synchronous and asynchronous ways online. Now to the question of when. One way to answer the question of when you assess is to think about frequency. We would argue here that assessment should be as frequent as is necessary to understand student progress towards the learning objectives. The more frequent assessment provides students and instructors with information for vital growth in a just-in-time way. However, instructors may need to weigh that frequency with time and labor limitations that they face. Another way to answer it is to think about how to structure assessment over time, and one word is particularly helpful here, scaffolding, which means the structuring of assignments in a sequence that leads students from what they already know towards new knowledge and skills with ever greater autonomy, engagement, complexity of thought, metacognition, and hopefully mastery. Here's an example of scaffolding, at least a general one, a template for a unit you might imagine in a course. You might change the assignments to better match your own subjects and goals, but hopefully you get an idea of what scaffolding may look like as students proceed through ever more complex learning tasks and assessments. To end Unit 1, Part 1, here's a reflection question. How will you structure formative and summative assessments in your course?